Hey Rebel Rouser, I'm Alan Voivod and this is Star Wars 7x7, your daily dose of Star Wars joy. And thank you so much for joining me for it. So the Shadow Council that we saw in Chapter 23 of The Mandalorian, The Spies, is not a new thing exactly. The Shadow Council was first organized after the events of Return of the Jedi. It figures in the Aftermath trilogy of novels by Chuck Wendig when various Imperials were trying to sort of look like warlords, basically exactly what we're seeing in The Mandalorian now, to look sort of unorganized, but we're secretly communicating and coordinating with each other so that when the time was right, they could attack and defeat the rebels, the New Republic, whichever you want to call it, at whichever time period. Back in the Aftermath novels, though, between 4 and 5 ABY, it was run by a guy named Gallius Rax, and he is no longer with us. But the people who ultimately survived the events of the Aftermath trilogy include Commandant Brendol Hux, who we just saw in the Shadow Council on The Mandalorian. He's also the father, of course, of General Hux from the sequel trilogy movies, but funnily enough, he's actually played in The Mandalorian by Brian Gleason, who is not Domhnall Gleeson's father. He's actually his brother, and his younger brother at that. Another person who's on the Shadow Council now is Captain Pellaeon, who is deeply associated with Grand Admiral Thrawn. He's only appeared in Thrawn Treason, one of the new Thrawn novels by Timothy Zahn, and as a name check in Star Wars Rebels in the final episode of the series, where Dave Filoni basically said, yeah, I thought I'd put the name in there just for fun in case anybody wanted to use him later. That episode came out in March of 2018. So you have to wonder how far he was thinking ahead about this stuff. I mean, The Mandalorian was certainly in development by that point, but whether he was already thinking about, 3 seasons later and the possibility that he could show up, I wouldn't put it past him, quite honestly. Now, we don't know a lot about Pellaeon in current canon, except that he is working within the 7th Fleet for Thrawn, and in Legends, he was sort of his second in command, basically. So, yes, definitely a very important character as far as the whole Thrawn buildup goes. Swinging back to Hux, though, I gotta point out the fact that at the end of the Aftermath trilogy, Hux escaped into the unknown regions to help rebuild the Empire. So the fact that Hux is showing up in the Mandalorian series is actually giving us a tie directly to the events of the sequel trilogy, to the building of the new Empire and the building of the First Order. That reference to Project Necromancer, which is a brand new reference, but it's kind of pretty obvious what that could be referring to, the idea of resurrecting Emperor Palpatine, especially when they talk about the idea of, perhaps there needs to be new leadership since Thrawn isn't showing up, and Hux's response is, yeah, that's what Project Necromancer is about. And as a last bit of speculation to throw into all of this, there's a reference in the Aftermath trilogy to child soldiers that Commandant Hux trained to be the personal bodyguards and assassins for Gallius Rex. Those child soldiers were brought to the unknown regions. I think there were about a couple of dozen of them. And who are the most fearsome fighters we know of in the sequel trilogy? It would be the elite Praetorian Guard that we saw in The Last Jedi, and we've just seen Praetorian Guards now in The Mandalorian as well. We don't necessarily know what became of those child soldiers that Hux was training, but wouldn't it be interesting if they grew up to be these crazy Praetorian Guards? They were absolutely brutal and deadly assassins, even as children. So yeah, why couldn't they grow up into something just as fearsome? Oh, and as a result of all of this, we have to consider the possibility that Grand Admiral Ray Sloane may show up in all of this too. She was one of the first new characters invented for Star Wars canon. She appeared in A New Dawn by John Jackson Miller. That was the novel presaging the start of Star Wars Rebels. Hux actually tried to kill Sloane in the Aftermath novels, but he wasn't exactly a fighter compared to Ray Sloan, who had some serious combat training, and she beat him handily, ultimately convincing him to work for her for the glory of the Empire, and also to be nicer to his son, which I don't know how well that worked out. But they developed a bit of a friendship, Sloan and Armitage Hux did. So yeah, we could see a child General Hux in this series too, which would be absolutely crazy. So that's what I've got for you in terms of additional context on the Shadow Council, who may be involved in it, what we know about the people who are already involved in it, and what speculations and conclusions we can jump to as a result of what we've seen so far. And that is going to do it for this episode of the podcast. It just remains for me to say thank you so much for joining me for it, as always. And may the Force be with you wherever in the world you may be.
7x7 is not endorsed or sponsored yet by Lucasfilm Limited, Disney, or 20th Century Fox, and is intended for entertainment and information purposes only. Star Wars, the Star Wars logo, all names and pictures of Star Wars characters, vehicles, and any other Star Wars related items are registered trademarks and/or copyrights of Lucasfilm Limited, or their respective trademark and copyright holders. May the Force be with them. All original content is copyright 2021 by Star Wars 7x7. We hope you love it.